My name is Michael Thompson, but everyone back home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, just called me Mike. I was 22 years old when I first set foot in the jungles of Vietnam, carrying nothing but a rifle, a pack full of letters from my mother, and a heart pumped full of American pride. I thought I knew who I was then, the son of Robert Thompson, a Korean War veteran who raised me on stories of honor and duty, and Margaret Thompson, a school teacher who filled our Sunday dinners with talk of God's plan for each of us. I remember the weight of my father's hand on my shoulder the day I enlisted. "Son," he said, his voice thick with emotion and whiskey, "you make us proud over there. You show them what a Thompson is made of." Those words echoed in my mind as I stepped off the transport plane into the suffocating humidity of Southeast Asia, where the air itself seemed to breathe with danger. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. Back then, I believed in the strength of my own hands, the accuracy of my aim, and the righteousness of our cause. I was a farm boy who could fix any broken engine, shoot a rabbit at 100 yards, and carry my weight in hay bales without breaking a sweat. The army had molded that rural toughness into something harder, sharper. I was part of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and wearing that patch made me feel invincible. Our base was Firebase Charlie, carved out of the jungle about 40 miles northwest of Saigon. The place smelled like diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the constant dampness that seemed to seep into everything. Our clothes, our food, our souls. We lived in wooden bunkers covered with sandbags, playing cards by candlelight and counting days until our tour ended. But I wasn't counting days. I was collecting stories to tell my father. Moments of heroism that would make him proud of the Thompson name. The other guys in my squad were good men. Tommy Martinez from East L, always cracking jokes to keep our spirits up. Bobby Jenkins from Alabama, who could make a meal out of nothing. And Sergeant Williams from Detroit, a career soldier who taught us everything we knew about staying alive. We'd been together for 8 months, through firefights and monsoons, sharing everything from cigarettes to fears whispered in the dark. I wrote letters home twice a week, always upbeat, always confident. "Don't worry, Ma," I'd write. "Your boy is doing fine. The jungle is tough, but not tougher than Iowa winters." I never mentioned the sleepless nights, the way my hands sometimes shook after contact with the enemy, or how I'd started having conversations with God that felt more like arguments. The truth was, Vietnam was nothing like the stories my father told about Korea. This wasn't a war with clear lines and definable enemies. The jungle itself seemed to fight against us. Vines that cut like razors, insects that carried disease, and an enemy that appeared and disappeared like smoke. But I was Michael Thompson, and Thompsons didn't quit. We'd been on patrol for 3 days when it happened. Intelligence had reported enemy movement in our sector, and we were part of a search and destroy mission that would take us deeper into the jungle than we'd ever been. The canopy above was so thick that noon felt like twilight, and every shadow could hide death. I remember the smell of rotting vegetation, the constant buzz of insects, and the way sweat stung my eyes. My gear felt heavier with each step, but I kept my complaints to myself. Leading from the front was what my father would have done, what any Thompson would do. I had no idea that within hours, everything I believed about myself, about life, about God, would be shattered like glass against the jungle floor. As we moved deeper into that green hell, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The jungle had eyes, and they were following our every movement, but I pushed forward, driven by pride and duty, toward a destiny I never could have imagined. The morning of October 15th, 1968, started like any other. I woke to the sound of helicopters cutting through the humid air and the smell of coffee brewing over a small fire. Tommy was already up. cleaning his rifle with the obsessive care of a man who knew his life depended on it. The metal parts gleamed in the filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate the jungle canopy above our position. "Another beautiful day in paradise," Tommy muttered, his usual morning sarcasm helping to cut through the tension we all felt. Today's mission was different. We could all sense it in the way Sergeant Williams moved, the tight set of his jaw, the extra care he took checking our equipment. "Listen up, gentlemen." Williams gathered us around his field map. "Intelligence says we've got a major supply route running through this sector. We're going in deep today, maybe 16 clicks into Indian country. Keep your eyes open and your mouths shut. This isn't a sightseeing tour." I studied the map, noting how the green ink marking our route seemed to disappear into vast areas marked only with elevation lines and question marks. The unknown territory called to something in me. Maybe it was the Thompson, need to prove ourselves, or maybe it was just youthful stupidity. Either way, I felt ready for whatever waited in those unmarked spaces. We moved out at 0600 hours, single file through vegetation so thick it seemed to swallow sound. I was point man that day, which meant I walked first into whatever dangers lay ahead. The responsibility felt heavy on my shoulders, but good heavy, like carrying my father's tools when I was young, proving I was strong enough for a man's work. The jungle pressed in from all sides. Vines hung like curtains, and the ground beneath our boots was spongy with decades of rotting leaves. Every few yards, I had to cut through vegetation with my machete, each swing releasing clouds of insects and the rich, earthy smell of disturbed soil. My uniform was soaked with sweat within an hour, the fabric clinging to my skin like a second layer of misery. We'd been walking for 4 hours when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the natural symphony of the jungle. It was subtle, almost lost among the bird calls and rustling leaves, but my country-trained ears caught it. Metal clicking against metal, the sound of weapons being prepared. I raised my fist, the signal for the squad to freeze. Behind me, I could feel Tommy, Bobby, and the others drop into ready positions, their breathing controlled, their senses heightened. Williams crept up beside me, his eyes scanning the green maze ahead. "What do you see, Thompson?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Nothing yet, Sarge, but something's not right up ahead. Too quiet." The jungle had indeed gone silent around us. No birds, no insects, even the constant drip of moisture from the leaves seemed to have stopped. It was the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, the kind that means death is holding its breath somewhere nearby. We waited, muscles tense, sweat mixing with camouflage paint on our faces. Minutes passed like hours. Then, without warning, the jungle exploded around us. The first shots came from our right flank, the sharp crack of AK-47s cutting through the humid air. Bark exploded from trees around us as bullets carved their deadly paths through the vegetation. I dove to the ground, my rifle already in my hands, training taking over where thought left off. Contact right, contact right." Williams was screaming into his radio, calling for support that seemed impossibly far away. The firefight erupted in full fury, muzzle flashes lighting up the green twilight like deadly fireflies, the smell of cordite mixing with jungle rot. I found myself behind a fallen log, returning fire toward enemies I couldn't see. The M16 bucked in my hands, shell casings flying, the familiar routine of combat overriding the fear that clawed at my chest. This was what we'd trained for, what we'd prepared for through months of patrols and smaller skirmishes. But this was different. This was bigger, more coordinated. The enemy fire was coming from multiple positions now, a carefully planned ambush that had been waiting for us to walk into its jaws. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and miles from any help. "Thompson, take Bobby and flank left," Williams shouted over the chaos. "Try to find their command position." I grabbed Bobby Jenkins by the shoulder, feeling the tremor in his muscles that matched my own. "Come on, Alabama, let's go show these boys how Americans fight." We low-crawled through the undergrowth, every inch forward, a gamble with death. The sounds of battle raged behind us. Tommy's distinctive laugh even in the middle of combat, William's barking orders, the whistle and crack of bullets searching for flesh. That's when I felt it, the impact that changed everything. Not pain at first, just a massive blow that spun me around and sent me crashing into a tangle of vines and rotting logs. The world tilted sideways, colors bleeding together like a water painting in the rain. Bobby's face appeared above me, his mouth moving, but I couldn't hear his words over the ringing in my ears. I looked down and saw the dark stains spreading across my chest, felt the warm wetness that meant my body was leaking life into the hungry jungle soil. "Go!" I managed to whisper to Bobby. "Get back to the squad." He hesitated, and I saw in his eyes the terrible choice every soldier faces: stay with a wounded comrade and risk losing more lives, or complete the mission and hope for the best. I made the choice for him. "That's an order, Private. Go." He disappeared into the green maze, leaving me alone with the sound of gunfire growing more distant and the realization that I was bleeding out in a jungle 10,000 miles from home. The Thompson pride that had carried me this far suddenly felt like a weight dragging me toward the dark. The jungle closed around me like a living tomb. As the sounds of battle faded into the distance, I was left with the deafening silence of my own mortality. The wetness in my chest had spread, soaking through my uniform and into the rich earth beneath me. Each breath felt like drowning in reverse, not water filling my lungs, but life slowly leaking out through the hole in my chest. I pressed my hand against the wound, feeling the warm pulse of blood between my fingers. The training kicked in: apply pressure, stay conscious, wait for help. But as minutes stretched into an hour, then two, the reality of my situation began to sink in like the dampness that penetrated everything in this green hell. The pain came in waves, starting as a dull ache and building to sharp spikes that made me bite my lip to keep from crying out. Not that anyone would hear me. The firefight had moved on, chasing my squad deeper into the jungle, or perhaps consuming them entirely. The thought of Tommy's jokes silenced forever, of Bobby's Alabama drawl cut short, made the physical pain seem almost secondary. I tried to move, to drag myself toward what I hoped was the direction of Firebase Charlie, but my legs wouldn't respond properly. The bullet had done more damage than I'd initially realized. Every attempt at movement sent fresh waves of agony through my body and opened the wound further. I was trapped, pinned to this spot by my own failing flesh. The jungle around me began to change as my perception altered. Colors seemed more vivid: the deep emerald of the leaves, the rich brown of the soil, the bright red of my own blood. Sounds became amplified: the distant call of some exotic bird, the rustle of small creatures moving through the undergrowth, the steady drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from leaf to leaf like a countdown timer. Time became fluid, meaningless. The filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate the canopy shifted and changed, telling me that hours were passing, but I couldn't track them anymore. My watch face was cracked, probably from the fall, its hands frozen at 14:37. That had been the moment everything changed. The instant when Michael Thompson, the invincible soldier, became Michael Thompson, the dying boy. Thirst became my most immediate torment. My tongue felt swollen, my throat raw. I could hear water somewhere nearby, a small stream gurgling over rocks, but it might as well have been on the moon. My canteen had been lost in the fall, probably lying somewhere in the tangle of vines and debris where I'd first hit the ground. As night approached, the jungle transformed into something primordial and alien. New sounds emerged from the darkness: the cough of a big cat somewhere in the distance, the rustle of something large moving through the brush, the constant chittering of insects that seemed to grow louder as my body temperature dropped. Every shadow could hide death, every sound could herald my final moment. The cold surprised me. I'd expected the jungle to be hot, stifling, But as the sun disappeared entirely, a chill began to creep into my bones. Or maybe it was the blood loss, the slow shutdown of my body's heating system. I began to shiver uncontrollably, my teeth chattering so hard I was afraid I'd bite my tongue. That's when the thoughts started coming, not the organized, rational thoughts of a trained soldier, but the desperate, scattered fragments of a mind facing its own extinction. I thought about my mother's apple pie cooling on the windowsill, about summer evenings playing catch with my father in our backyard, about Susan Hendricks and the way she'd kiss me goodbye at the bus station when I left for basic training. I thought about all the things I'd never do. Never see another Iowa sunrise, never taste my mother's cooking, never hold my own children, never grow old sitting on a porch somewhere, telling stories about the war. The future I'd taken for granted began to evaporate like morning mist, leaving behind only the increasingly desperate present moment. The letters in my pack pressed against my back. 7 unopened letters from home that I'd been saving to read together when we got back to base. Now I'd never know what news they contained, what encouragement or love my family had tried to send across the vast distance that separated us. The irony was almost funny. Surrounded by greenery so thick it choked out the sky, I was dying of loneliness. Fear crept in as the darkness deepened. Not the clean fear of combat, which could be channeled into action and purpose, but the slow, corroding fear of helplessness. I was going to die here, alone, my body becoming food for the jungle that had already claimed so many others. My parents would never know what happened to me, never have a grave to visit, never have closure. The Thompson pride that had sustained me began to crack under the weight of reality. All my life, I'd been taught that strength and determination could overcome any obstacle, that American ingenuity and Iowa stubbornness were unbeatable combinations. But here, bleeding into foreign soil, I was discovering the limits of human will. As the jungle night reached its full oppressive darkness, I felt something inside me breaking apart. Not just physically, though the wound continued to pulse and weep, but spiritually. The confident young man who had stepped off the transport plane was dying along with his body, leaving behind something smaller, more frightened, more human. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the words to prayers I'd learned as a child, sitting in the wooden pews of Cedar Falls Methodist Church. But the words came broken, jumbled, mixed with profanity and desperation that would have scandalized my mother. Still, they were all I had left, fragments of faith in the face of approaching darkness. The jungle breathed around me, patient and eternal, waiting for me to join the countless others who had fallen beneath its green embrace. And for the first time in my life, I began to understand that I might not be strong enough to fight my way out of this one. The second night was when I broke completely. Not just my body, which had been failing steadily since the bullet tore through my chest, but something deeper, the core of who I thought I was. Michael Thompson, the farm boy who could fix anything, fight anyone, endure everything. That person crumbled in the darkness of the Vietnamese jungle like a house of cards in a hurricane. The fever had started sometime during the second day. At first, it felt almost welcome. Warmth returning to my shivering body, color back to my gray world. But as hours passed, it became another enemy, another source of torment. My wound had begun to smell, the sickly sweet odor of infection mixing with the jungle's natural perfume of rot and renewal. I knew enough battlefield medicine to understand what that meant: sepsis, blood poisoning, the body's final surrender to damage it couldn't repair. Hallucinations danced at the edges of my vision. I saw my father standing among the trees, wearing his old army uniform, shaking his head in disappointment. "Thompsons don't quit, son," he seemed to say, but his voice sounded hollow, distant. I reached for him, trying to explain that I hadn't quit, that I was still fighting, but my hand passed through empty air and humid darkness. I saw Tommy Martinez grinning at me, his face unmarked by war. "Hey, Iowa," he said in that familiar L, a drawl. "What you doing lying around? We got places to be, man." But when I blinked, he dissolved like smoke, leaving me more alone than before. Were they dead? Had the ambush claimed my whole squad? I had no way of knowing, and the uncertainty gnawed at me worse than the infection. The pain had evolved beyond anything I'd experienced. It wasn't just the sharp agony of the wound anymore, but a deep, systemic ache that seemed to emanate from my bones themselves. Every breath was labor, every heartbeat an effort of will. My body was shutting down in stages, and I was conscious for all of it. By the third day, I couldn't remember why I was fighting to live. The reasons that had seemed so important, returning home, making my parents proud, surviving to tell the story, felt abstract, disconnected from the immediate reality of suffering. All that existed was the next breath, the next heartbeat, the next wave of pain crashing over me like a dark tide. That's when the real breaking began. Not the clean breaking of bones or the sudden snap of ligaments, but the slow dissolution of everything I'd built my identity upon. I wasn't a hero, I wasn't a good soldier, I wasn't even a good son. I was just a scared kid, dying alone, 10,000 miles from everything that mattered. The sobs came without warning, great heaving gasps that sent fresh spikes of agony through my chest. I cried for my mother's arms, for my father's strength, for the simple comfort of human touch. I cried for the future that was slipping away with each labored breath, for dreams that would die with me in this anonymous patch of jungle. "Please," I whispered to the indifferent darkness, "please, somebody help me." But there was no somebody. There was only the jungle, eternal and unmoved by human suffering, continuing its ancient cycle of growth and decay, while I lay caught between life and death in its green embrace. As the third night deepened, desperation drove me to places I'd never expected to go. I wasn't a religious man. Church had been something we did on Sundays because it was expected, not because I felt any deep connection to the divine. God was something adults talked about, a distant figure who supposedly watched over us, but never seemed to actually intervene when intervention was needed. But dying changes your perspective on everything, including theology. "God," I croaked into the darkness, my voice barely audible even to myself. "God, if you're there, if you're listening." The words felt foreign in my mouth, awkward and uncertain. How do you talk to someone you've ignored your whole life? How do you ask for help from a being you've never really believed in? "I don't know how to pray," I admitted to the night air. "I don't know the right words. But I'm scared, and I'm alone, and I don't want to die like this." The jungle offered no response, no sign that my words had been heard. The insects continued their eternal buzz, water continued to drip from leaf to leaf, and death continued its patient approach. I felt foolish for even trying, for reaching out to something that was probably just another human invention, another story we told ourselves to make the darkness less frightening. But desperation is a powerful force, stronger than pride, or logic, or rational thought. As my body continued its slow surrender, my spirit reached out in every direction, grasping for anything that might offer hope, comfort, or meaning in the face of approaching extinction. "Jesus," I whispered, the name feeling strange on my lips. I'd heard it used as an expletive more than as a prayer, especially in the army, but something about saying it in this context felt different, more purposeful. "Jesus, if you exist, if you care about people like me, I need help." The words hung in the humid air like smoke from a cigarette, dispersing into the vast indifference of the jungle. I closed my eyes, trying to find some sense of peace or presence, some indication that I hadn't just wasted my breath on empty syllables. Nothing, just the steady rhythm of my failing heart and the gradual approach of whatever came after life. The breaking was complete now, not just physical, but spiritual, emotional. existential. Everything I had been was leaking out along with my blood, leaving behind only fear and loneliness and the growing certainty that this anonymous patch of jungle would be my final resting place. I had reached the absolute bottom of human experience, the point where hope dies and only darkness remains. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that sometimes you have to fall completely before you can be lifted up. The breaking was complete. What came next would redefine everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the invisible forces that move through our world. It was the fourth night when everything changed, not gradually, not subtly, but with the sudden completeness of dawn breaking over a dark horizon. I had given up. That's the truth of it. I had stopped fighting, stopped hoping, stopped believing that rescue would come or that I would see another Iowa sunrise. My body was shutting down in stages, and my mind had begun to accept the inevitable. I lay there in the darkness, my breathing shallow and irregular, when I became aware that something had changed in the jungle around me. The quality of the silence was different. Not the empty silence of abandonment, but the full silence of presence. It was like the moment just before a storm breaks, when the air itself seems to hold its breath in anticipation. At first, I thought it was another hallucination, another cruel trick of my fever-addled brain. But this felt different from the ghostly visits of my father and Tommy. This felt real, solid, undeniable. The temperature around me seemed to warm slightly, and the oppressive weight of despair that had been crushing me began to lighten, just a fraction. Then I saw him. He didn't approach with footsteps or announce himself with words. He was simply there, sitting beside me in the darkness as naturally as if he'd been there all along. My first instinct was terror. After 3 days alone, any human presence should have been either salvation or threat, rescue or enemy. But what I felt instead was an overwhelming sense of peace, a calm so profound it seemed to emanate from him like warmth from a fire. I couldn't make out his features clearly in the jungle darkness, but his presence was unmistakable. He was neither young nor old, neither large nor small. Somehow he seemed to exist outside the normal categories that define physical appearance. What struck me most were his eyes, visible even in the dim starlight that filtered through the canopy. They were deep, ancient, filled with a compassion that seemed to encompass not just my suffering, but the suffering of every soul who had ever drawn breath. "You called for me," he said, though I'm not certain he spoke aloud. The words seemed to form directly in my consciousness, bypassing my ears entirely. His voice carried the cadence of home, familiar, comforting, like my mother's lullabies or my father's bedtime stories. I tried to speak, to ask who he was, but my throat was too dry, my voice too weak. It didn't matter. Somehow he knew my questions before I could voice them. "I've been here all along, Michael," he continued, and hearing my name spoken with such tenderness nearly broke me all over again. In every moment of pain, every hour of fear, every second of loneliness, I've been here. You just couldn't see me through the pride. Pride. The word hit me like a physical blow because I recognized its truth immediately. All my life, I had insisted on doing things my way, solving my own problems, being strong enough for anything, the Thompson way. Even in this jungle, even bleeding out and dying, I had been trying to fight through it alone, to somehow muscle my way back to life through pure determination. "I don't understand," I managed to whisper, the words barely audible. He reached out and touched my forehead, and instantly the fever that had been burning through me began to recede, not healing. The wound was still there, still seeping life into the jungle floor. But comfort, the kind of relief that comes from knowing someone else is carrying the burden with you. "You don't have to understand," he said. "You just have to let me help." The simplicity of it was overwhelming. No complex theology, No conditions or requirements, no lengthy process of earning divine assistance, just an invitation to stop fighting alone, to accept that some battles were too big for one person, even a Thompson from Iowa. Tears came then, not the desperate sobs of despair I'd shed earlier, but something cleaner, more healing. Years of accumulated pride and stubbornness seemed to flow out of me along with the salt water, leaving behind a strange lightness I'd never experienced before. "I'm scared," I admitted, the words feeling like confession. "I know," he replied. And in those two words was an acknowledgement of everything I'd been through. The terror of combat, the agony of my wounds, the crushing loneliness of dying alone. He knew it all, had felt it all, somehow carried it all. Am I going to die here? The question hung in the humid air between us, and for a moment I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Death had seemed so certain for so long that I'd almost made peace with it. But now, with him beside me, other possibilities seemed to flicker back to life. "That's not the important question," he said gently. "And the important question is, what are you going to do with whatever time you have left? How are you going to live? Live, not just survive, not just endure, but truly live." The distinction seemed crucial, though I wasn't sure I understood why. As if reading my confusion, he continued, "You've spent your whole life trying to be strong enough, good enough, worthy enough. But strength isn't about carrying everything alone, Michael. Real strength is knowing when to let others help." The jungle around us seemed to settle into deeper quiet, as if even the insects and night creatures were listening to this conversation. The pain in my chest continued, but it no longer dominated my consciousness. Something larger was happening, something that made physical suffering seem temporary and secondary. "Who are you?" I finally asked, though part of me already knew. When he smiled, it was like watching the sun rise over an Iowa cornfield, gentle, warm, full of promise for a new day. "I think you know," he said. "I'm the one who hears when you call, even when you've forgotten how to pray. I'm the one who stays with you when everyone else has to leave. I'm the friend who sticks closer than a brother." Jesus. The name formed in my mind without being spoken aloud, and with it came a rush of recognition that went deeper than intellectual understanding. This wasn't the Jesus of stained glass windows or Sunday school illustrations. This was someone real, present, immediate. Someone who had chosen to sit with me in the worst moment of my life simply because I had asked. I'm not a religious person, I felt compelled to admit. I don't know the Bible, don't go to church except when my mother makes me. Don't even know if I believe in God most of the time. "Religion isn't the point," he said, his voice carrying gentle amusement. "Love is the point. And love doesn't require perfect knowledge or flawless behavior. It just requires an open heart." My heart, which had been closed for so long behind walls of Thompson pride and masculine toughness, began to crack open like an egg. Everything I thought I knew about strength and weakness, about independence and dependence, about what it meant to be a man, started to shift and rearrange itself in the presence of this impossible visitor. The night was no longer dark. Somehow, without any visible light source, the world around us had begun to glow with a soft radiance that made everything clear and beautiful. The jungle that had been my prison became a cathedral. The rotting vegetation transformed into something sacred and meaningful. For the first time in 4 days, I wasn't alone, and I would never be alone again. Dawn was breaking through the jungle canopy when I realized the most profound truth of my life. I had a choice to make. Not between life and death, that decision seemed largely out of my hands at this point, but between two completely different ways of being alive. The old Michael Thompson, who faced everything alone and measured worth by physical strength, or someone entirely new, someone who understood that real power came from connection, from allowing others to help, from admitting weakness without shame. Jesus, and I no longer questioned that's who he was, remained with me as the darkness gave way to filtered green light. His presence hadn't been a fever dream or dying hallucination. If anything, I felt more clear-headed now than I had since taking that bullet. The infection still coursed through my system, the wound still leaked precious fluid, but something essential had changed. I was no longer fighting this battle alone. The sun rises in Vietnam just like it does in Iowa, he observed, his voice carrying that same gentle warmth that had sustained me through the night. Light is light, no matter where you find it. I managed a weak smile at that. My mother always said that every morning when I was growing up, she'd open the kitchen curtains and say, "Look, Michael, another day full of possibilities." Wise woman. What do you think she'd say about the possibilities in this day? The question caught me off guard. Here I was, probably dying in a jungle 10,000 miles from home, and he was asking about possibilities. But as I thought about it, I began to understand what he meant. Even in this desperate situation, especially in this desperate situation, choices remained available to me. I've been angry, I admitted. Angry at the war, angry at the army for sending me here, angry at God for letting this happen, angry at myself for getting shot. Anger isn't wrong, Michael. It's what you do with it that matters. I thought about that as I watched a butterfly land on a nearby leaf, its wings brilliant orange and black against the green backdrop. Beautiful and fragile, it represented something I'd never allowed myself to be. Delicate, yet resilient, dependent on forces beyond its control, yet perfectly designed for its role in the larger scheme of things. I don't want to be angry anymore, I said, surprising myself with the declaration. It's eating me up from the inside, worse than any infection. Then choose something else. Simple words, but they carried the weight of complete transformation. I could choose gratitude instead of anger, trust instead of fear, connection instead of isolation. The circumstances of my situation hadn't changed. I was still wounded, still lost, still in serious danger. But my relationship to those circumstances was entirely within my power to alter. I choose to forgive, I said, testing the words. I forgive the soldier who shot me. He was probably just as scared as I was. I forgive the politicians who started this war. I forgive God for letting it happen. I paused, then added the hardest part, and I forgive myself for not being strong enough to handle this alone. As the words left my lips, I felt something physical happen inside my chest. Not healing exactly, but a loosening, as if bands that had been constricting my heart had suddenly released. The pain was still there, but it no longer carried the additional weight of resentment and self-recrimination. That's the beginning of real strength, Jesus said. Not the kind that tries to carry everything alone, but the kind that can receive help, offer forgiveness, and stay open to love even in the midst of suffering. Through the morning hours, he taught me things I'd never learned in all my years of Sunday school. Not theology or doctrine, but practical wisdom about living with an open heart. About how vulnerability wasn't weakness, but courage. About how asking for help wasn't failure, but intelligence. About how love wasn't just an emotion, but a choice you made every day, sometimes every moment. What about my father? I asked. He taught me that Thompsons stand on their own feet, solve their own problems, never show weakness. Your father did the best he could with what he knew, came the gentle reply. But some of what he learned came from his own wounds, his own fears. You can honor him while still choosing a different path. I thought about my dad, about the way he'd held his emotions so tightly, about the distance that had grown between us as I'd tried to live up to his standards of masculine strength. Maybe his hardness hadn't come from strength at all, but from fear. Fear of appearing vulnerable, fear of not being enough, fear of the world discovering that even Korean war heroes sometimes felt scared and alone. I want to be different, I said. If I make it home, I want to be the kind of man who can cry when he needs to, who can ask for help when he's overwhelmed, who can tell people he loves them without being embarrassed. And if you don't make it home, the question should have frightened me, but it didn't. Then I want to die knowing I finally understood what it means to be truly alive. As if in response to my declaration, I heard something that made my heart leap, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. Faint at first, barely distinguishable from the jungle's natural sounds, but growing steadily stronger. Someone was looking for me. "Is that?" I began. "Search and rescue," Jesus confirmed. "Your friend Bobby made it back to base. They've been looking for you for 2 days." Bobby, alive, the relief nearly overwhelmed me. At least one of my squad had made it out, had remembered where I'd fallen, had guided the rescue team to this anonymous patch of jungle where I'd been learning the most important lessons of my life. "Are you going to disappear now?" I asked, sudden fear clutching at my heart. "Now that help is coming." "I'm never going to disappear, Michael. You just have to remember how to see me." He placed his hand over my heart. "I'm here now, in every act of kindness you choose, every moment of forgiveness you offer, every time you let someone help you instead of insisting on handling everything alone." The helicopter sounds were getting closer, and I could hear voices calling my name through the jungle. American voices, familiar accents, the sound of home reaching across 10,000 miles to pull me back from the brink. But I was no longer the same person who had fallen in this place 4 days ago. That Michael Thompson, proud, self-reliant, emotionally distant, had died here in the jungle. What was about to be rescued was someone entirely new, someone who understood that real strength came not from isolation, but from connection, not from never falling, but from accepting help when you did. "Thank you," I whispered as the rescue team's voices grew louder. "Thank you for calling," he replied, and I felt rather than saw his smile. "It's what I've been waiting for your whole life. The choice to live, really live, with an open heart and humble spirit had been made. Everything from this moment forward would be different, not because my circumstances had changed, but because I had finally learned who I really was and who I was meant to become. The helicopter was almost overhead now, and soon this chapter of my life would end. But the story that had begun in this jungle clearing would continue for the rest of my days. A story of transformation written in love and sealed with the understanding that none of us were ever meant to walk alone. The medevac helicopter that lifted me out of that jungle clearing carried more than just a wounded soldier. It carried a man who had been fundamentally transformed, though I couldn't have articulated that change at the time. All I knew was that the world looked different through my eyes as we rose above the green canopy, brighter somehow, more connected, infused with a meaning I'd never noticed before. Bobby Jenkins was in the chopper, his Alabama drawl thick with emotion as he gripped my hand. "Jesus, Thompson, we thought you were done for. 4 days, man. 4 days we've been looking." I squeezed his hand back, though my grip was weak. "Jesus," I repeated, and the word carried different weight than Bobby's casual usage. "Yeah, he was there." Bobby looked at me strangely, probably attributing my words to blood loss and delirium. How could I explain what had happened in that jungle clearing? How could I tell him that I'd had a conversation with the divine, that everything I thought I knew about strength and faith and what it meant to be a man had been completely rewritten? The medic working on me was efficient, professional, inserting IVs and checking vitals with practiced ease. "You're in rough shape, soldier, but you're going to make it. That's some infection you've got going, and we need to get you cleaned up, but the wound missed anything vital. You're one lucky son of a gun." Lucky. I almost laughed at the word, but I was too weak. Lucky would have been never getting shot in the first place. What I'd experienced was something far more profound than luck. It was grace, unearned and undeserved, arriving exactly when I needed it most. At the field hospital, everything became a blur of antibiotics, surgery, and the strange sensation of being horizontal on clean sheets instead of jungle floor. The doctors worked quickly to clean out the infection, repair the damage, pump me full of medications that gradually brought my fever down and my strength back up. But the real healing wasn't happening in my body. It was happening in my spirit, in the way I looked at the nurses who cared for me, the way I spoke to the other patients, the way I thought about my future. The old Michael Thompson would have been impatient to get back to his unit, frustrated by his weakness, determined to prove he could handle anything. This new version was content to rest, grateful for help, and deeply aware of how interconnected all of our struggles really were. "Thompson, you've got mail," announced the orderly, dropping a stack of letters on my bedside table. 7 letters from home, plus 3 more that had arrived while I was missing. I opened them slowly, savoring each word in a way I never had before. My mother's letters were full of news from Cedar Falls. Who was getting married, how the corn was growing, what the preacher had said in last Sunday's sermon. But reading them now, I could see the love between every line, the careful way she chose words that would comfort and encourage her son so far from home. I'd never noticed that before, had always skimmed her letters for practical information and quickly moved on. My father's letter was shorter, more awkward, but I could read between his stilted phrases to the fear he wouldn't express directly, the love he couldn't quite articulate, the pride he felt but didn't know how to communicate. "Son," he wrote, "and your mother prays for you every night. I do too, in my own way. Come home safe." I cried reading that, openly, without shame, letting the tears fall onto the paper. The old Michael Thompson would have been embarrassed by such display of emotion, would have quickly wiped his eyes and looked around to make sure no one had noticed. But this version understood that tears were not weakness, but recognition of love, connection, the precious fragility of human relationships. "You okay, Thompson?" asked the soldier in the bed next to mine, a kid from Detroit who'd caught shrapnel in his legs. "Yeah," I said, not bothering to hide the tears. Just grateful to be alive. Over the next 2 weeks, as my body healed, I found myself changing in ways that surprised everyone, including myself. I started conversations with other patients instead of keeping to myself. I thanked the nurses and orderlies by name, asked about their families, treated them like human beings instead of just medical staff. I wrote longer letters home, sharing not just the facts of my situation, but my feelings, my thoughts, my growing understanding of what really mattered in life. Most surprisingly, I started talking to other soldiers about faith, about God, about the experience I'd had in the jungle, not preaching. I wasn't qualified for that and wouldn't have known how even if I was, but sharing, testifying to the reality of divine presence in the darkest moments of human experience. "You really think he was there?" asked Jimmy Morrison, a machine gunner from Oregon who'd lost 2 fingers to enemy fire. "You think God actually shows up when you're dying?" "I don't think," I replied. "I know he's been there all along, Jimmy. We're just usually too busy or too proud to notice." These conversations led to others. Before I knew it, I was part of an informal group of soldiers who gathered in the hospital chapel on Sunday evenings, not for formal service, but just to talk about life, about faith, about what we'd learned in the crucible of combat. We called ourselves the Foxhole Christians, and we laughed about the old saying that there are no atheists in foxholes, but underneath the humor was a serious exploration of how suffering could open doors to understanding that had been closed before. The day came when I was declared fit for transport back to the States. My war was over. The infection had done enough damage that I'd be medically discharged, sent home with a Purple Heart and a lifetime of memories. But as I packed my few possessions, I realized I wasn't the same person who had unpacked them at Firebase Charlie 8 months earlier. The plane ride home gave me 24 hours to think about what came next. How do you explain to people that you've been fundamentally changed? How do you live in a world that values the same things you used to value? Strength, independence, emotional control, when you've discovered that real life happens in the opposite direction. As we flew over the Pacific, I thought about Jesus in that jungle clearing, about his words that real strength came from connection rather than isolation. I thought about my father, about the example he'd set of masculine toughness, and how I might honor him while still becoming someone different, someone softer and more open to love. The stewardess noticed I was awake and came over to check on me. "How are you feeling, soldier?" "Different," I answered honestly. "Everything feels different now." She smiled kindly. "That's what coming home does to people." But I knew it wasn't coming home that had changed me. It was going deeper into darkness than I'd ever imagined possible and finding light waiting there, patient and eternal and utterly personal. It was discovering that the God I'd ignored most of my life had never ignored me, had in fact been orchestrating moments of grace and presence that I'd been too proud or too busy to recognize. The lights of San Francisco appeared below us like scattered diamonds, and I knew that my real journey was just beginning. I was coming home, but home would never be the same, because I would never be the same. The man who had called out to Jesus in a Vietnam jungle was returning to Iowa transformed, ready to live a completely different kind of life. The question now was whether I'd have the courage to actually do it. Cedar Falls looked exactly the same as I remembered, but I saw it through completely different eyes. The tree-lined streets, the familiar storefronts on Main Street, the water tower that had been the tallest structure in my childhood world. Everything was precisely as I'd left it, but I was not the same person who had looked upon these sights before. The young man who had boarded the bus to basic training 2 years earlier no longer existed. In his place was someone I was still learning to be. My parents were waiting at the bus station, and I saw them before they saw me. My father stood with his familiar military posture, scanning the disembarking passengers with the methodical attention he brought to everything. My mother waited beside him, her hands clasped tightly, her face showing the strain of 2 years of worry that were about to end. When our eyes met, I watched her expression transform from anxious searching to overwhelming relief. "Michael," she whispered, and then I was in her arms, feeling smaller and younger than I had since childhood. She smelled like flower and vanilla extract, like home and safety and unconditional love. I buried my face against her shoulder and let myself be held, something the old Michael Thompson would never have done in public. My father approached more cautiously, his eyes taking in the changes the war had made to his son. I was thinner, scarred, moving with the careful gait of someone whose body had been through trauma. But there were other changes too, ones that couldn't be seen but could somehow be felt. "Son," he said, extending his hand. I looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then stepped forward and embraced him instead. His body went rigid with surprise. We'd never hugged, not even when I was small, but after a moment, I felt his arms come up around me, tentative at first, then stronger. "I missed you, Dad," I said against his shoulder, and I felt something shift between us, some old wall beginning to crack. The ride home was full of careful conversation, the kind families have when they're trying to navigate changed territories. They asked about my injury, my recovery, my plans now that I was home. I answered as honestly as I could, though I left out the most important parts. How do you tell your parents that you met Jesus in a jungle clearing? How do you explain that everything they taught you about being strong and independent was wrong, or at least incomplete? That first night, lying in my childhood bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile two worlds. Outside my window were the sounds of Iowa, crickets and wind through corn stalks, the distant whistle of a freight train carrying grain to market, safe sounds, familiar sounds, the soundtrack of a life I'd thought I was fighting to preserve, but inside my chest was a different rhythm entirely, one that had been set in motion beside a muddy foxhole 10,000 miles away. I couldn't sleep, so I walked downstairs to the kitchen, where my mother was sitting at the table with a cup of tea, waiting. "I knew you'd be down," she said without looking up. "First night home is always the hardest." I poured myself a glass of milk and sat across from her at the same table where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 18 years. "Ma, can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey." "Do you really believe in God? I mean, really believe, not just Sunday morning believe?" She looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time since I'd gotten home. "Yes," she said simply, "especially after the last 2 years, worrying about you every day, praying every night that you'd come home safe." "Why do you ask?" "Because I met him over there, in Vietnam. I was dying, and he came and sat with me, and he showed me that everything I thought I knew about life was backwards." I expected her to look skeptical, to suggest that trauma and blood loss might have caused hallucinations. Instead, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Tell me about it." So I did. I told her about the ambush, about lying wounded and alone, about the fever and the fear and the slow dissolution of everything I'd built my identity upon. I told her about the presence that came in the darkness, about conversations that changed everything, about learning that real strength came from connection rather than isolation. She listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving my face, and when I finished, she was crying. "Your grandfather would have understood," she said finally. "He never talked about it much, but he had an experience in France during the First World War, something that changed him completely. He came home a different man, gentler, more present with his family. I always wondered if something like that might happen to you. The guys at church won't understand. Neither will Dad. Some will, some won't. But that's their journey, not yours. Your job is just to live what you learned." Over the following weeks, I began the difficult process of translating jungle revelation into Iowa reality. I got a job at Morrison's feed store, work that felt meaningful because it served farmers, people who fed others. I started attending the Methodist Church regularly, not just because my mother expected it, but because I was hungry for community, for people who understood that spiritual life was more than just Sunday performance. Some people welcomed the changes they saw in me. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the church social committee, was thrilled when I volunteered to help with the monthly dinners for elderly members. Michael Thompson, offering to serve food. She marveled. I never thought I'd see the day. Others were less comfortable with my transformation. When I tried to talk to my old high school friends about faith, about the reality of divine presence, they looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Vietnam really messed you up, didn't it?" one of them said, not unkindly, but with the dismissive tone people use when they think someone has become too religious. The hardest adjustment was with my father. He watched me with puzzled eyes as I helped my mother with housework, as I talked openly about feelings, as I spent evenings reading the Bible instead of working on car engines or watching sports. Finally, one Saturday morning while we were fixing the porch steps together, he couldn't contain his confusion any longer. "Son, I don't understand what happened to you over there. You're different, softer. I'm worried you lost your edge." I set down my hammer and looked at him directly. "Dad, I didn't lose my edge. I found something better than an edge. I found out what real strength looks like. Real strength is standing on your own 2 feet, solving your own problems, not depending on anyone else. That's what I used to think too. But I was wrong. Real strength is knowing when to ask for help, when to lean on others, when to admit you don't have all the answers. Real strength is staying open to love, even when it makes you vulnerable." He shook his head. "That's not how I raised you. I know. And I'm grateful for everything you taught me, but some lessons I had to learn on my own, and they changed everything." We worked in silence for a while. both of us processing what had been said. Then, as we were cleaning up tools, my father spoke again, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I had moments in Korea, he admitted, times when I was scared, when I didn't think I could go on. I never told anyone about them because I thought that's what it meant to be a man. Keep it to yourself. Handle it alone. What if you hadn't kept it to yourself? What if you'd been able to talk about it? He was quiet for a long moment. And I might have been a better father, a better husband, less afraid of my own feelings. That conversation marked the beginning of a new relationship between us, one built on honesty rather than performance, connection rather than competition. It took time, old patterns die hard, but gradually we learned to talk to each other about things that mattered, to share struggles instead of hiding them, to be vulnerable instead of perpetually strong. 6 months after returning home, I met Sarah Collins at a church social. She was a school teacher, gentle and intelligent, with a laugh that reminded me of church bells on Sunday morning. What drew me to her wasn't just her beauty, but the way she listened when people talked, the way she noticed when someone was hurting and found quiet ways to help. "You're different from most men," she observed after we'd been dating for a few weeks. "You actually seem to care about what I think and feel." "I learned something important about life," I told her. "I learned that we're not meant to go through it alone. We're meant to take care of each other, to pay attention to each other, to let each other matter." We were married the following spring, in the same Methodist church where I'd learned my first prayers as a child. But the man who stood at that altar was nothing like the boy who had sat in those pews years earlier. This man understood that love was not possession, but partnership, not conquest, but collaboration, not performance, but presence. At our wedding reception, my father stood up to give a toast. He'd never been comfortable with public speaking, preferring action to words, but something had changed in him too over the past year. "My son went to war and came home different," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. At first, I thought he'd been weakened by what he experienced, but I was wrong. He came home stronger than I'd ever taught him to be. But it was a different kind of strength, the kind that builds up instead of tearing down, that includes instead of excluding, that loves instead of fears. He paused, looking directly at me. "I'm proud of the man you've become, son, and I'm learning from your example." Later that night, as Sarah and I sat on the front porch of our new home, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, she asked me about the scar on my chest, about the story I'd never fully told her. So I told her everything, about the ambush, about lying wounded and alone, about the presence that came in the darkness and changed everything. I told her about Jesus sitting beside me in that jungle clearing, about learning that real strength came from connection, about discovering that love was the only thing that really mattered in the end. She listened with the same attention my mother had shown, and when I finished, she took my hand. "That's why you're different," she said. "That's why you know how to love so well. You learned from the source." Years passed. We had children, 3 beautiful souls who grew up understanding that their father was strong enough to cry, wise enough to ask for help, secure enough to show affection without embarrassment. I became a deacon in our church, not because I had all the answers, but because I'd learned to ask the right questions. I started a veterans support group for men struggling with the transition from war to civilian life, sharing what I'd learned about finding strength in vulnerability. Sometimes, usually late at night when the house was quiet, I would think back to that jungle clearing, to those 4 days that changed everything. I would remember the weight of despair, the certainty of death, the complete dissolution of everything I thought made me who I was. And then I would remember the presence that came in the darkness, the voice that spoke peace into chaos, the touch that brought healing to wounds I didn't even know I carried. The scar on my chest faded over the years, but the scar on my soul, the place where pride had been cut away and love had been allowed to grow, remained tender and alive, a constant reminder of what I'd learned in the depths of a Vietnamese jungle, that we are never truly alone, that help comes to those who ask for it, and that sometimes you have to be completely broken before you can become completely whole. I am Michael Thompson, son of Robert and Margaret, husband of Sarah, father of 3, and child of God. I am a veteran of foreign wars and domestic peace, a man who learned that real strength comes not from standing alone, but from knowing when and how to reach for help. I am living proof that miracles still happen, that Jesus still shows up in the darkest moments of human experience, and that no one is ever so lost that they cannot be found. This is my story. This is my testimony. This is my life, lived in gratitude for grace received in the most unlikely of places, from the most faithful of friends, in the hour when hope seemed lost, but love proved stronger than death. Dear listeners, we hope Michael Thompson's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.